The Gilded Age is an absorbing and enjoyable period drama, but it's not without its issues. The story does tend to meander a little, and some of the subplots aren't all that interesting. However, the Gilded Age does have a stacked cast, lavish set design, and some absolutely gorgeous costuming, making it one of the more impressive-looking period dramas on TV right now. After the success of Downton Abbey, it was always going to be a tough ask for Fellow's follow-up series to hit those same lofty heights. And inevitably, many people are likely to jump into this hoping that it is. Now, if one can separate that comparison and go in with an open mind, The Gilded Age presents its story with a sharp commentary on ambition, greed, and excess. The story is set in old New York, deep in the heart of the 1880s. Old money and new money collide when the Russell family move into the neighborhood and immediately begin shaking things up. George Russell is a ruthless railroad tycoon and will steamroll over anyone who stands in his way. His wife, Bertha, is desperate to make it into the upper echelons of society, while their daughter Gladys is just along for the ride. Across the street live two aunts, Ada and Agnes. The pair don't always see eye to eye, and when their niece Marion Brooke comes to live with them, those disagreements hit fever pitch. Marion is also joined by the family's new secretary, Peggy Scott, who engages in her own subplot as the season progresses. There are additional characters here, but for the most part the hour-long chapters revolve around these central players. Acted out as part soap opera and part slice-of-life drama, most of the episodes center on individual issues that balloon into larger plots. From train accidents and suicide through to scandalous affairs, The Gilded Age presents an array of different topics, but it never quite leans into the campy or crazy feel Downton Abbey manages to achieve. This is likely to be the biggest issue people will have going into The Gilded Age, and some of these subplots really don't go anywhere. The Peggy Scott story is left unresolved by the end, despite some nice commentary about race relations at the time, while Gladys doesn't do very much here, despite the promise of her growing into a larger role during the show's opening few chapters. Production-wise, The Gilded Age looks fantastic, and there's no denying that the aesthetic and general feel of the show lends itself nicely to the time period. There are some overarching issues with things like pacing and a couple of subtle anachronisms, but for the most part, the team have done a great job bringing this time period to life. It's not perfect, and at times the show does crumble under the weight of expectation. If you can go in with an open mind though and accept this is a simple but enjoyable period drama, The Gilded Age has enough in the tank to make for a decent watch. Let's start the story recap of The Gilded Age Season 1. Episode 1 of The Gilded Age begins in New York, 1882. It's all hustle and bustle as the Russell family move into their new home. At the front and center of this family are the ambitious and rather ruthless George and Bertha. This causes quite a stir in the neighborhood, with two aunts across the road watching through their window as the Russells move into their lavish new home. It doesn't take long for George to stamp his authority at work, where he makes bold changes to the railroad. As he says himself, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Those two aunts we mentioned earlier are that of Agnes and Ada, who have their own issues. Bound from Pennsylvania, Marion contacts them both following the loss of her father, learning she's been left with a measly $30 to her name since his passing. That doesn't exactly please Agnes, who sees Marion as a leech that just wants their money. Ada is more optimistic and understanding, suggesting she could be put to work as a governess. At the train station, a fight between two men breaks out. In the ensuing scuffle, Miriam's purse is stolen. Her ticket and everything else she has left to her name is gone, leaving a kindly woman called Peggy to pay for another ticket. Of course, it's not a free ride, and Penny decides to show up at her aunt's place to be reimbursed. When Miriam reveals what transpired at the station, Agnes is incredulous to the whole story. Nonetheless, Peggy is brought in and allowed to stay for the night. The thing is, Agnes has a condition. She wants her parents' address just in case anything untoward happens. While Peggy leaves, Agnes immediately throws Miriam into the thick of the rich society. She doesn't want her wearing black, despite being in mourning, likening her to a crow. She's also not happy about her suggestion of heading off to work. Marion is quick to be reminded that she's part of old New York, the proud rich society that sniff at the idea of others invading their space. This immediately sends ripples of tension between Miriam and Agnes. In the morning, Agnes offers Peggy a job as a secretary after being impressed by her handwriting. Given the latter wants to avoid her parents, Agnes quashes that immediately, likening her to a fugitive and urging Peggy to call home to let her parents know where she is. Peggy refuses to see her father, whom she has a long-standing grudge with, and meets her mother instead. Peggy wants to pay her own way, but her mother drops off some cash to see her through her time in New York nonetheless. Miriam's intent on heading out to work sees her take Agnes's place during an invitation to help train orphans to be servants. Ada encourages her to take up this offer, pointing out that there will be people her own age there. Meanwhile, Bertha and her daughter Gladys show up at a gathering, where Ada and Miriam also happen to be. The subject of the charitable gig is brought up, while Miriam breaks down the walls between the two families as she happily chirps up, expressing interest in the palace the Russell family are staying in. When Bertha heads home and talks to George about the day's events, George worries that these women are vultures and just want their money. The Russells are essentially new money and intent on shaking up the current foundations in town. That, of course, is not going to sit well with Agnes. Nevertheless, Bertha arranges for a soiree to be held at their home and sends out a number of different invites. Ada and Agnes scoff at theirs when they receive it and decide not to go. Miriam, though, ignores her aunt's suggestion and sneaks out that night. Very few people show up at the soiree, with the few attendees there clearly after her money. Namely that of Mrs. Fane, whose intentions are outed. Bertha immediately narrows her gaze and tells the stuffy old woman to leave. In fact, Miriam leaves too, especially when she realizes she's been lingering too long, and she doesn't want her aunts finding out. When she heads back home, Agnes decides to give her an allowance. Following the failed soiree, Bertha takes herself to bed. George follows and encourages her not to give up. Bertha is livid though, and as she lies with her eyes wide open, she promises to make them sorry. Episode 2 of The Gilded Age begins with Marion preparing for the arrival of a lawyer called Mr. Rakes. He's the man who settled Henry's estate and he's due to visit. Peggy chirps up when she learns about this, wanting to speak to him about a personal matter. Peggy plays her cards close to her chest though, not telling Marion the exact reason why. We as the audience also don't learn why either, at least not this episode anyway. Meanwhile, Agnes continued to express disdain toward Gladys and the Russell family. Ada's much more receptive though, pointing out to her sister that money isn't everything. The thing is, in this society money talks. And it's worth remembering this line as it comes into play during the chapter's climax. Anyway, I digress. When Marion shows up with the rest of the women, discussing the charity event they have planned, the conversation naturally swings toward the Russells. Marion wants to invite them to be among the stall holders. Mrs. Morris and the others refuse outright, wanting the event to be as pure as possible. The irony here is that they could really do with the Russells' money in order to make the event a success, which is due to be held at the Veterans Room. Mr. and Mrs. Morris soon show up at the Russell house to discuss about the charity bazaar. Verbal daggers are thrown across the table between Bertha and Mrs. Morris, as their hot lunch is juxtaposed by the icy words traded. This verbal spat soon paves way for George talking to Patrick in confidence. George wants to build a new station to shake up the railroad, encouraging Mr. Morris that it's in his interest to buy shares before agreeing to do the deal. In doing so, the share price would then skyrocket and give them all a tidy profit. It's an under-the-table suggestion, hence why it's not done in the official capacity of the office, and something George is quick to admit is just a suggestion. When the pair leave, it's clear the real reason for this night was to reel in Patrick for work, rather than the squabbling ladies and the charity event. Meanwhile, trouble brews outside for Mrs. Bauer, the Russell cook. She has a big gambling debt, and Peggy notices the debt collector outside. She owes $50, around $1,200 in today's terms, and Peggy urges Marion to help her out. Ever the one with a kind heart, Marion asks Oscar for help with paying the debt. Although he agrees, Oscar does so on one condition: they set up a luncheon with Gladys. Ada soon catches wind of what's happening and interjects. She speaks to Marion in confidence and decides to pay the debt herself. She also encourages Marion to come to her next time something like this happens. In the morning, things take a turn for the worst. The charity bazaar event is due to go ahead, but not at the Veterans Room. Instead, the women have moved the event to the Fifth Avenue Hotel. When Bertha finds out, she's livid. The Russell family show up and George immediately ruffles feathers. In fact, he buys out every single stall, demanding everyone pack up their gear and move to their own ballroom. It's absolutely genius, and although Mrs. Astor isn't convinced this is going to win anyone over, money talks, and with George waving away bills so readily, it certainly makes a splash. As everyone begins to peel out, Mrs. Astor is left with a free morning. So naturally, she heads upstairs as gracefully as one can. Episode 3 of The Gilded Age starts with the Brooks discussing the upcoming speech of Clara Barton, a nurse who established the American Red Cross. She's bound for Aurora Fane's home, which Ada and Marion decide to attend. While there, Ada bumps into an old friend from Pennsylvania called Cornelius. He wants to revive an old friendship with her, but Ada can only laugh awkwardly. Naturally, Agnes is suspicious, and it seems she's right. Later in the episode we learn that Cornelius has been spotted boasting in a local bar about how he's going to have a meal ticket by marrying Ada. Agnes confronts him and calls Cornelius out for his dire finances, promising that there will be no financial incentive to marrying Ada. In learning this, he hastily leaves. The main drama here, though, stems from George Russell, who brandishes the morning newspaper and learns secondhand that the railway proposal has been rejected. This certainly catches him off guard. The city aldermen have gone back on their deal, and it comes off the back of their stocks. They intend to make triple the investment they normally would, bagging a tidy profit on stocks and attempting to swallow Russell's business and ideas in the process. All of this, of course, hidden behind the facade of a railway not being in the public interest. George is livid, calling Mr. Morris a thief and gritting his teeth, promising revenge. Back home, George speaks to Bertha about the risk they're facing. This is a war, and he could lose everything by playing his hand. Bertha stands by his side, though, allowing George to risk the estate and trusting that a good deal of money to swing the balance of power back on their side will work. If not, well, they can always build their fortune again. So George immediately buys up every stock that goes on the market. This financial power play immediately worries Morris, who's incredulous that the stock has risen. Nothing has fallen, like he predicted, but soon we learn why he's so invested in this. Morris is deep in debt and has bet absolutely everything he has on this play. The thing is, there's only so much one man can do, and the aldermen brush it off, believing George will only hold up for a day or so. But is that really worth betting the house on? While all this is going on, Oscar and John Adams continue their secret relationship, but discuss the notion of marrying to keep up pretenses. And for Oscar, he's set his sights on Gladys. She seems like the perfect girl, but with word on the street that George Russell will be wiped out in a few days, Oscar realizes he needs to find another woman to satiate his need for more money. At the same time, a publisher from the Christian Advocate writes to Peggy, wanting to print one of her stories. However, that good news is soon quelled when her father shows up and wants to talk. He wants her to come home, given it's her mother's birthday coming up. Peggy reluctantly agrees, but only for one day. Unfortunately, Peggy experiences racism at the Christian Advocate, and in particular, the editors have specific changes for her story. Mostly it comes from changing the black characters to white, which Peggy is understanding not happy about. Not only that, she'll also need to hide her race, and even worse, once she signs the stories over, they'll belong to them. So she refuses. The situation with the stocks continues to worry the aldermen, who even send Mrs. Morris over to try and patch up her differences with Bertha. When she asks for mercy and pity, Bertha scoffs at her feeble attempts and forces her out. As a shell-shocked Mrs. Morris leaves, Bertha's sly grin speaks volumes. Meanwhile, Tom Rakes heads out with Marion and proposes to her in Madison Square. Marion is surprised and doesn't give her answer right away, echoing back to the earlier moments of this episode where Agnes warned her about Rakes. Agnes scoffed at his ideas, calling him an adventurer and vehemently deciding that they're ill-fit for one another. And given Marion is there to stay with her aunts and living off their money, she's got no choice but to succumb to their will. At the office, Mr. Fane, Morris and the other aldermen all gather together in George's office and beg him for mercy. Morris even gets down on his knees and pleads with him. Unfortunately, it falls on deaf ears, with George bringing up the belittling of Bertha as a valid reason, making sure their actions don't go unpunished. That night, George speaks to Bertha in private and decides the aldermen have been punished enough and will confirm as much in the morning. Unfortunately, it's too late. Mr. Morris heads up to his office and commits suicide that very night, shooting himself. Episode 4 of The Gilded Age begins with a stark juxtaposition. While Mr. Morris is buried and his service held, applause breaks out with George Russell and the aldermen as they look over schematics and plans for the new railway. After the big meeting, George receives a telegram informing of Mr. Morris's death. He does pay his respects, apologizing for the unfortunate suicide and reminding Mr. Fane that this is not a game for the weak. For Fane, he realizes George is his best ticket for getting out the predicament their family faces and encourages his wife to make amends with Bertha. Meanwhile, Peggy continues to go on the hunt to try and become an acclaimed writer. Her next target is T. Thomas Fortune, who works for the New York Globe. She excitedly lets Marion know as the pair go shopping together before the big gig. When she arrives, Peggy meets Mr. Fortune, who gushes over her writing. She's given a 200-word article to discuss political affiliation without voting rights. It doesn't pay much, but it is a foot in the door. Elsewhere, Ada is distraught when her dog goes missing. Although half the staff believe someone will bring the dog back, others aren't so sure. Well, as fate would have it, it shows up next door at the Russell house. Bertha decides to give it a bath and feed it before sending a letter next door to let them know. Agnes, though, believes that this is a kidnapping when she receives that aforementioned note, a way to force the families closer together. They do eventually get the dog back, but Agnes, as per usual, remains wary. When a wood-carved box shows up from Mrs. Chamberlain, Ada is horrified and urges Marion to take it back. When she shows at her house, Mrs. Chamberlain invites Marion in to check out the lavish art collection she has. The woman's motivations are unclear, but after she encourages Marion to show up again. Back home, Marion decides to visit Brooklyn and surprise Peggy Scott, who's back with her family for the time being. As she tells them about her writing, things grow heated as her dad bemoans Peggy's fool errand. Marion shows up with a bag holding old shoes. Peggy covers for her, though, claiming it's for a charity, but clearly Marion believed Peggy was living a life of poverty and has been called out for it. In private, Peggy lashes out at Marion, pointing out that they live in very different worlds. She also tells her not to try and be friends. Following the earlier truce with Mr. Fane, Aurora swallows her pride and shows up to see Bertha. She invites her along to meet Mr. McAllister, who's a sort of gatekeeper for the upper echelons of society. Aurora wants them to be friends now, even inviting Bertha along to watch a concert with her. The big night arrives and Bertha leaves in a lavish red dress. Just prior to this, it's worth noting there's a particularly awkward moment as Miss Turner, the hired help, waits for George in his bed, naked. George immediately shoos her out, pointing out she's made the wrong assumption, and he has no interest in having a mistress. At the concert, Marion ends up meeting Tom Rakes, who happens to be in the box next to hers. They get talking, but as the third act of the symphony begins, she tellingly looks at Rakes and hopes there will be a happy end. Episode 5 Recap. According to Agnes Van Ridge and Christine Baranski, charity has two functions in polite society. The first is to raise funds for the less fortunate, while the second is to serve as a social ladder for the ambitious people. The thing is that everyone involved in these kinds of endeavors is well aware of this, as the characters are in the Gilded Age. Clara Barton has no delusion about why someone like Bertha Russell shows interest in the Red Cross and comes to meet her in Dansville, New York, where she has set up the first branch of the organization in 1881. She also knows what Aurora gains from introducing Bertha to her. She accepts the transactional aspects of these dealings because they are ultimately good for the people she is trying to help. At the Russell household, Gladys continues to rebel against the constraints her mother has put on her. George, Morgan Spector, warns his wife that such a strict attitude toward their daughter might prove to be detrimental to ensure her safety, but largely stays out of it. Mrs. Bruce convinces Bertha to allow Gladys a lady maid of her own, and Adelaide, a girl of Gladys's age, is promoted to the position. Meanwhile, Oscar, Blake Ritson, and Ms. Turner, Kelly Curran, become acquainted and decide to work together so they both can get what they want. Bertha finally meets Warren McAllister at Aurora Fane's house. Marion and Rakes are also there to keep the conversation going. It soon becomes apparent to everyone present that Bertha and McAllister are cut from the same cloth. They are both ambitious, ruthless in their own ways, and very pragmatic about wealth. Marion and Peggy resume their friendship, but not before the latter sets certain boundaries. Peggy's mother visits the Brooke household and asks Marion to convince Peggy to return to her own family in Brooklyn. Agnes sends Peggy with Marion as she goes to Dansville to meet Barton. They accompany Bertha and Aurora, and Rakes also joins the group. In Dansville, Barton happily gives an interview to Peggy. Later in the evening, Marion and Rakes share a kiss but are interrupted by Peggy before it can become something more. Episode 6 of The Gilded Age begins with the aftermath of the train crash. George is concerned, especially when he learns 5 people have lost their lives. There's no women or children involved though, which is at least something, as George hands over a donation to the Red Cross and, by extension, Mrs. Barton. For her help, the wounded are in Pennsylvania hospital, and George contemplates whether to go there or not. However, before he even thinks about showing up, newspaper reporters show to snap photos of the pair and get their story. George decides to front this and not hide. In private, George learns that the accident was caused by metal fatigue and a broken axle. It would seem that someone has sabotaged the process, meaning that someone without the organization has blood on their hands. Thankfully, the news is going easy on George for now, thanks in part to Bertha claiming he's grief-stricken. With the press off their back, George doubles down on finding the saboteur. Agnes is obviously nonchalant to this entire incident back home, pointing out that 5 deaths aren't that many. However, Marion is far more sympathetic about the cause, and as she walks with Peggy, they discuss what's happened. Naturally, the conversation turns to Mr. Rakes, where Peggy exhibits her concerns, pointing out that he doesn't seem to have much of a plan. After the donation to the Red Cross, the society all vote on allowing Mrs. Russell inside their inner circle. However, Mrs. Morris is disgusted, pointing out that she's essentially paid her way in and refusing to be part of this circus. So naturally she walks away. Bertha soon receives an invite for Warren McAllister to come and visit her palace. Naturally she relays on her concerns to the staff, wanting to make sure they're fully briefed and with English food to boot. Given her French chef isn't accustomed to this, it turns to recruiting someone who does know about this. Someone like Mr. Bannister across the road. When he shows up, Bertha offers him $100 to come and serve at the luncheon. He accepts the invitation with a spring in his step. He also makes sure to hide this from Agnes, whom he knows will react badly when she finds out. Eventually, though, the 2 chefs join forces, as Mr. Bannister delegates his responsibilities to Jack, who will prepare lunch for Agnes and Ada instead. Between the sabotage problems, George shows up to see Gladys, forbidding her from seeing Mr. Baldwin anymore. Bertha doesn't see him as special enough, deciding Gladys is not to marry a banker from Manhattan. That afternoon, a super creepy doll party goes ahead with the other members of society. Gladys and Larry both show up, but it's clear they're completely out of their comfort zone here. It doesn't take long for Gladys to start talking to Carrie, where they find solace in pointing out how overbearing and dominant their mothers are. Marion is left conflicted over what to do regarding Rakes. She vents to Mrs. Chamberlain about this, who takes up the same guarded stance as her aunts. Chamberlain does offer a more sympathetic ear though, deciding that Marion can meet Rakes at her place and see whether he really is a good match for her. So why is Chamberlain doing all this? Well, apparently she's grateful for Marion showing respect to her, given she's the first person to do that since Augustus died. The big luncheon goes ahead with Warren McAllister showing up and immediately being greeted by Bannister. He's happy with their English butler and lavishes praise on their abode. While their meal goes ahead without a hitch, Jack finds himself clumsily pouring wine, missing the glass, and struggling to please the sisters. However, Agnes receives a letter and immediately marches over to Bertha's place, demanding to know where Bannister is. After finding him inside the dining room, she decides against making a big scene, but does grit her teeth and tell Bannister that heads have rolled for less. Bannister returns later that afternoon and remains determined to find out just who wrote the letter telling Agnes about his deception. He decides to speak to Armstrong, who's actually with Agnes in her room, pointing out the betrayal she's seen. Specifically, she mentions how Oscar was spotted outside with the Russell maid. As she wonders what they may be conspiring together, George receives a telegram informing him of the saboteur. His name is Dixon, and he's actually head of the team that built the engine. Unfortunately, Dixon also claims to have written proof confirming George gave the order and allowed this to go ahead. But how could Episode 7 of The Gilded Age starts with George Russell unveiling his plans for a new railway station, Union Central Station. Using electricity to light up the interior, the whole crowd gather and marvel at this beautiful model. The thing is, the whole situation is marred by an undercurrent of worry. After all, George is still hung up over the letter from Mr. Dixon and his accusations that he greenlit the axles to be installed on that train. A few of the officials have actually seen the document too, and apparently it's legit. Unfortunately, there's even a statement beforehand, written in what appears to be George's handwriting, telling him that he needs to cheapen things up no matter what. George admits that it sounds like him, but he's not so sure. After all, some money has gone missing which could swing things in his favor. Either way though, it looks like this is going to court. It'll either be Dixon standing trial or George. If the latter is in court, George could be charged with manslaughter by negligence and jailed. Meanwhile, Larry reels from his rejection. After asking George to be an architect and receiving a blanket no chance, he heads outside. There, he runs into Marion, who gently encourages him, reassuring the man that he only has one life, and making the wrong choice will haunt him for many years. Meanwhile, hostility continues to brew for Agnes toward Bannister. She's not even talking to him either, using Ada as a messenger to pass on whatever she has to say. This only fuels Bannister's desire to figure out who ratted him out and wrote the letter. Agnes's anger is also directed toward Oscar and Miss Turner, whose scandalous affair gets her thinking about whether to tell Bertha or not. So naturally, she decides to send Marion over to request Bertha fire Turner, which she eventually does. However, when Oscar finds out, he ironically sees it as a big plus, given he can now access the Russell family house again without the fear of being found out. While he didn't plan it this way, he is an opportunistic man and sees this as a big win. Turner is not happy though and arrives before George, asking if he's the one who had her sacked. He wasn't, of course, but before she leaves, tells George that she would have loved her fully had he let her. Just before Turner leaves the estate though, she writes to Bannister and lets him know who sent the letter. Bannister ominously retorts that revenge is a dish best served cold upon reading what she's written. Rakes meets Marion outside and gushes over her beauty before eagerly asking to meet in private again. He kisses her hand as the pair arrange a meet at Chamberlain's. Left to their own devices, they get on well, and eventually Rakes decides to propose off the back of Chamberlain, imploring them to discover if this is really love or not. Some of Rakes' words do ring alarm bells, especially when he seems to try and convince himself of this love. That's also something Marion picks up on too. However, the excitement and euphoria emanating from him asking Marion's hand in marriage is enough for her to change her mind. The thing is, Agnes is not convinced by Rake's motives and shoots down the man's aspirations and ideas when Marion returns home. That's obviously going to make their marriage all the more difficult. That night, a big meeting gets underway as Edison gives a speech about electricity. Agnes and Ada aren't there, of course, and also, by extension, neither is Marion. Peggy is there though, working on behalf of the newspaper. Thomas Edison eventually steps up and addresses the people, igniting the street in a beautiful display of electrical lights. Bertha marvels at the sight, dismissing McAllister's ominous question about the direction humanity is taking and shrugs it off, claiming they go where history takes. Episode 8 of The Gilded Age starts with George Russell preparing for his hearing against the judge. He's angsty, unsure whether he's going to win or not. All the lawyers by his side have found nothing untoward regarding Dixon's past, and George Russell is growing impatient. It's not looking good. Meanwhile, Bertha informs her staff that the family are going to be in Newport for 10 days. Not George, though, given the court trial he's currently dealing with. John and Oscar see this news as a good opportunity to improve the latter's standing with the family, with Oscar dead set on making good on his promise to wed Glady. John, though, just wants to carry on as they are. Aurora takes Marion aside over at the Brooke household and brings up Mr. Rakes. She's worried about him, given he seems to be everywhere, but Marion reassures her that everything is okay. Speak of the devil, Mr. Rakes appears with a letter just as they speak. Marion happens to be upstairs, and she talks to Peggy, admitting she's made a decision. She's going to marry Mr. Rakes after all. She's surrounded by doubters, and is convinced that this is the right thing to do. Marion visits Rakes at his office, and as the pair kiss, solidifying their upcoming marriage. With Bertha and Gladys over to see Miss Fish in Newport, issues involving Peggy and Miss Armstrong begin to stir back in New York. It turns out Peggy was married and pregnant to a man named Elias Finn, who used to work at her father's pharmacy. Unfortunately, when her father found out about Peggy, he forced Elias to sign papers admitting he was previously married. The reason Peggy is so torn up about this is that she believes Miss Armstrong may have actually intercepted the letter Mr. Rakes sent over earlier in the season, confirming he was unable to find the midwife. Armstrong is not stupid, and Peggy realizes she probably told the aunts what's happening. So the only thing for it is for Peggy to admit the truth to Ada and Agnes. Peggy does just that, but Agnes is surprisingly sympathetic about her plight. She too has lost a child and knows how painful this can be. Peggy decides to leave, while Agnes is not happy with Miss Armstrong given she spun the story in an ugly way to claim she bore an illegitimate child. Armstrong is saved from being fired thanks to her stature within the family, but Agnes does her best to try and convince Peggy to stay. She admits this is unfair, but lets her go. George Russell's hearing goes ahead, but the lawyers are abuzz as they've found a crucial bit of evidence to help swing things in George's favor. That comes in the form of Miss Ainsley, Mr. Russell's stenographer. Earlier in the episode, Marion uncovered Ainsley's ties to Dixon by change, partly thanks to her disguising her real name, which happens to be Dixon. The same Dixon that happens to be in charge of building the railroad. Ainsley is questioned about her ties with Dixon, where we learn that George's original note was actually in response to Bertha's suggestion of a company renovating his office, but George found them too expensive. So essentially Ainsley forged the note, word for word, to make it seem like he approved the cheaper parts. She and Dixon had misappropriated funds before, and now they're caught red-handed. George is exonerated, while Dixon and Ainsley are referred to the prosecutor's office and could well be jailed. Before he goes, George promises to make it impossible for Ainsley to get a better job above scrubbing floors, keeping tabs on her indefinitely. With the George issue sorted, over in Newport tensions flare between Oscar and John. John and Gladys begin growing closer together at dinner, laughing and generally having a good time. All of this is a game, but one that Oscar has a terrible poker face for. When Mrs. Astor returns to the house, though, Ward and Aurora hurriedly smuggle Bertha out through the kitchen. As she heads out the back entrance, with all the staff watching her, Bertha walks away with her head held high, despite the humiliation. As the first season of the Gilded Age comes to an end, various characters face turning points in their respective lives. Marion's Louisa Jacobson plan to elope with Rakes. Thomas Cockrell encounters the issues that her well-wishers have feared. As Peggy, Deanie Benton, returns to Brooklyn, she learns that her father has hidden something very important from her. After the insult she suffered in the previous episode, Bertha becomes even more determined to establish her family in the New York polite society, deciding to enter a direct feud with Mrs. Astor, and her ball becomes the battleground. Larry, Harry Richardson, has all but convinced his father about letting him pursue a career in architecture. Monsieur Bawden is revealed to be not who he says he is. Meanwhile, Oscar Blake Ritson decides to make the best of his chances with Gladys at the ball, where the latter finally comes out in society. Here is everything you need to know about the ending of the Gilded Age Season 1. Let's start the finale of Season 1, Episode 9 recap. In the Season 1 finale, titled Let the Tournament Begin, Marion prepares to elope with Rakes. Everyone around her has reservations about the young man, not just Agnes, Christine Baranski. Because of her naivety, Marion holds on to the belief that he will marry her just as he has promised. Ada, Cynthia Nixon, figures out that her niece is running away. Although she desperately wants her not to do that, she doesn't stop the younger woman. Meanwhile, at the Scott household, a member of the house staff finds a note in one of Arthur's pockets and gives it to Dorothy. When she reads it, she is visibly shaken by its content. When Peggy returns home, she informs her daughter about it. Peggy immediately starts to fall apart, realizing the extent of what her father hid from her. As Gladys and Carrie prepare their dance for the ball, Bertha visits Mrs. Astor's home to personally invite her to the ball. However, she is told that Mrs. Astor isn't there and sent back from the door. When she sees another person being let in, she realizes that Mrs. Astor doesn't want to meet her. Just like her husband, Bertha can be incredibly ruthless when she needs to be. She returns home and tells her family that they are removing Carrie from the list of dancers. The mysterious woman Bawden has been seen speaking to turns out to be his estranged wife. After learning that he now works for the Russells, she has come seeking reconciliation. She does have certain leverage over Bawden, so he does the only reasonable thing left for him to do and speaks to George Morgan Spector, admitting that he is not really French. He is Josh Burdane, originally from Wichita, Kansas. Josh worked as a seaman for a while, eventually making his way to Cannes. There, he began working at a restaurant and eventually received all the necessary training. When he came to New York, he discovered that no one wanted to hire a chef from Wichita. So, he conjured up a French identity and taught himself to speak in a fake French accent. By the time he joined the staff of the Russell household, the masquerade had gone on for a while. Although Bertha fires him, he comes through for the Russells when his replacement becomes drunk on the day of the ball. Afterward, Bertha and George reinstate. How does the Gilded Age Season 1 end? For Marion, though, she's intending to brave this world and face it head-on alongside her aunts after all, with Ada convincing her that this is home, and she can stay for as long as she wants. And so the season ends with the ball a success and a beautiful crane shot down the road. As we see the two sides have finally reconciled, the Gilded Age bows out with a conclusive chapter, one that finally gives closure to the Rakes situation, as Marion sees his true colors and finally understands what a deceptive guy he is. It's a hard lesson to learn, but hopefully one that she will take with her going forward. Meanwhile, there are plenty of talking points and potential bouts of drama to come later on down the line. There's the situation involving Peggy finding her birth son, Gladys getting closer to Oscar, and the situation with George Russell and his railway still to take place. All of these are likely to be big talking points going into the second season. For now, though, this final episode sees Bertha and George on the up, holding their heads high as the ball is a success, and they manage to navigate through this murky myriad of class warfare to come out on top in the end.